The transfer window is in full swing, and one of the biggest moves of the summer has been Declan Rice joining Arsenal. I feel like this is a great move for Arsenal, giving them a strong player in that defensive midfield role, a good destroyer in their midfield. I think it's really good for them because it's a position where they haven't really had a strength in a long time. Now, Thomas Partey isn't a bad player, but it feels like Arteta doesn't really trust him, and aside from Partey and maybe Alex Song, I feel like Arsenal have been really weak in that defensive midfield role for a long time, towards the end of Wenger's reign actually. They never really found a replacement for Gilberto Silva after he left, Patrick Vieira as well, and that spot has been really weak for Arsenal, and it's taken them this long to replace somebody who left the club over 10 years ago. And that's something I kind of want to talk about. Teams replacing all-time great players. Replacing great players can seem like an impossible task. Sticking with Arsenal, when they lost Thierry Henry, it seemed like you couldn't fill that void. I mean, he was a guy who scored 20 goals and had 20 assists in one Premier League season, arguably the greatest Premier League player of all time. But they found a good successor in Robin van Persie, and while they're not the same player and Henry was greater, when Van Persie was there, he was a good successor. Striker wasn't a weakness for Arsenal. Liverpool never got a striker who could score goals like Luis Suarez, but Roberto Firmino was great in that spot when Liverpool were winning the Premier League and the Champions League. And then Real Madrid had to replace an all-time great, the best center-back of the generation in Sergio Ramos, and they didn't miss a beat without him. It's certainly possible to replace these all-time great players. Now, these aren't one-for-one replacements, but these teams were able to find successors to all-time great players, and make it so that position wasn't a weakness at all, and those great players weren't really missed. And I think that's something that can be a really tough thing to do, and a lot of teams, even ones that spend a ton, have really struggled with this. I'm not going to be talking about smaller teams like Southampton not finding a Virgil van Dijk replacement. I think that would be unfair. I want to talk about a team that spends a ton of money but have had a position be a big weakness for a really long time. Chelsea have had massive issues up top since Diego Costa left the club. Now, things haven't been all doom and gloom. I mean, they won a Champions League, but for a team capable of such good cup runs to have never competed for a Premier League title since Diego Costa left, that seems like they're underachieving. And this isn't something like how Chelsea sold Ashley Cole and haven't had a world-class left-back since. I mean, I think Ben Chilwell is perfectly suited for a team challenging for a Premier League title. They haven't had a striker who looks capable of playing for a team in the Champions League. And they spent a ton of money on Morata, Higuain, Werner, and Lukaku, players who have excelled in other teams, but they couldn't make it work for Chelsea. Chelsea isn't the only club that struggled to replace a player at a particular position. I mentioned Arsenal with defensive midfielders earlier, but I think the most egregious example is at Manchester United. Now, United have had a lot of issues in the post-Ferguson era, and I think, like Chelsea, you can make an argument for them not having a great striker, but I think that they've had enough short-term success and enough players with one really good season that I don't think it's as much of an issue, even though they do need a real solution at the number 9 position. I think the worst example for Manchester United is at right back. Manchester United have had a big issue at right back, I'd argue since 2007, the last really good year of Gary Neville's career. Neville was probably the greatest Premier League right back of all time, and after he left, it's been a real weakness for Manchester United. The next season they were able to have Wes Brown fill in a role, one of the most underrated players of the 2000s, but he was more of a center back being played out of position. And things continued like that for a good amount of time. United used John O'Shea and Phil Jones and Antonio Valencia out of position for a long time. Valencia was weirdly good at that spot, one of the better players in the league at the time, but he was always more of a stopgap, and I don't think he was ever truly comfortable as a right back. And the only other players who were really good at that time were maybe Raphael, who looked a bit out of place in the backline of Evra, Ferdinand, and Vidic. And then after that, they brought in Dalot and Wan-Bissaka, and I'm a big fan of Wan-Bissaka, but his tenure at United really hasn't been a success. Diego Dalot really hasn't looked like a guy capable of competing for a Premier League title or a Champions League level team. And that right back spot has really been a huge weakness for United ever since Gary Neville left. And there are some more examples that I could go over, but I want to talk more about why this is an issue. Why some teams just have problem positions that they haven't been able to find a solution for in a really long time. And I think there are a lot of reasons for it. The first one is just money. It costs a lot to buy some players for really top teams. And if they miss on one, they might have to wait a long time to bring in another player. I mean, you can't, or at least shouldn't be allowed to, break the bank for a striker in every single season. So maybe you'd want to give a guy a year or two to develop, maybe he shows a bit of promise, make it 3. And doing that can just push you back years and just having a suboptimal guy in one spot. Another thing to think about is just how good players have to be at the highest level, and how well-rounded they have to be. I mean, when you look at Chelsea's striker position, I think that if you combine all of them, you have a great player. The work rate and off-the-ball ability of a Timo Werner, and then the passing ability of Kai Havertz, even though he wasn't signed as a striker, the goal scoring of Lukaku, all of them are very good players. I mean, they've had success outside of Chelsea. What Chelsea have needed is a player who has all of their ability. So, let's say in 2021, you had Timo Werner, who was very good for the team, but just couldn't come up with goals. They kind of made an overcorrection in signing Lukaku, who is an amazing goal scorer, but that's kind of all he is as a player. And then again, they overcorrected, leaving Lukaku behind and putting Kai Havertz as striker, who does a lot of really good things. It's just finishing wasn't one of them. Aaron Wan-Bissaka is one of the top defensive right backs in the world, and maybe in 2007 he could have been a good replacement for Gary Neville. I mean, Wes Brown and John O'Shea aren't exactly known for their offensive abilities outside of 1 or 2 moments. But in a game where Trent Alexander-Arnold is able to be one of the best right backs in the world while being a defensive liability, Aaron Wan-Bissaka's offensive ability just doesn't cut it. And that's something else teams need to keep track of, being just ahead of the time and being able to change with the game. I mean, I think Lukaku could have easily been a very good striker in a lot of times in the Premier League, but with what strikers are asked to do today, it just hasn't worked out for them. Staying on top of things and having a good long-term plan seems to really help out clubs. Arsenal seem to have finally found their guy with Mikel Arteta, and they finally started to fill those holes. Not just Declan Rice, but striker had been a bit of an issue for them, and Gabriel Jesus seems to be a very good player for Arsenal. And then look at other well-run clubs. Bayern Munich had a seemingly irreplaceable player in Philipp Lahm, but Joshua Kimmich has been a very good successor. I mentioned Real Madrid earlier, and forget Sergio Ramos, they really don't miss Cristiano Ronaldo. I mean, Vinicius and Benzema aren't the same player that Ronaldo was, but they do a job. And then look at Pep Guardiola and Man City. I mean, they've replaced just about every legend they have. Aguero, take him out and replace him with Haaland. Yaya Toure, Rodri's been doing a good job. Vincent Kompany, Ruben Diaz. It just hasn't been an issue replacing those legendary players at all for a well-run team. Or maybe it's just clubs getting unlucky. I mean, we had every reason to expect Aaron Wan-Bissaka would turn into a really good right back, but it just didn't happen. Or maybe it's player development. I don't really know, but it's something interesting that I want to talk about. I think it's very weird that some of the best teams in the world can just have huge glaring issues in their squad. And something I want to talk about and give some credit to a couple of good teams for being able to fill in those holes. And yeah, that's all I have to talk about. See ya.